I'm lost in your haze where the lights are low, drowning in the depths of your eyes. I'm ready to go. In the shadows we'll find our way. Through the night our love will stay. In your love I'm lost, I'm found. In your heart my home is bound. Forever I'll be yours, you'll be mine. Lost in your haze, our love will shine. In your love, I'm lost, I'm found. In your heart, my home is bound. Forever I'll be yours, you'll be mine. Lost in your haze, our love will shine.
Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. Matthew Hill. Dr. Matthew Hill is a professor of cell biology and anatomy at the University of Calgary. His laboratory studies cannabis and its effects on stress, its effects on feeding, and its effects on the behavioral impacts of cannabis exposure at different stages of development. The origin of today's podcast episode is a bit unique, so I'd like to share a little bit of that background with you. Previously, I did a solo episode of the Huberman Lab podcast about cannabis, the biology of cannabis, some of its medical applications and uses, as well as some of its potential harms. That episode came out several years ago now and remains a very popular episode. It's had millions of views and millions of listens. Several months ago, we posted a clip of that episode to X, formerly known as Twitter. And Dr. Matthew Hill responded to that clip on X with criticism about the specific points made within that clip. Most notably, my discussion of the data that cannabis use can, in some individuals, cause psychosis. He also took issue with some of the specific points I made in that clip related to potential differences in the biology of the effects of different strains of cannabis, most notably indica versus sativa strains, and a few other points as well. Now, as somebody who's been in the field of science for several decades now, I'm very familiar with the fact that every single field within science has debates within it, controversies, and sometimes outright battles. And to me, that's part of what makes science interesting. It's an evolving process. It's something for which we should all be very curious to try and understand what we know, what we don't know, and try and get to the real answers. So right off the bat on X, I invited Dr. Hill onto the podcast, and he accepted the invitation. So today's episode is really a unique one in that, first of all, we cover an enormous amount of biology and clinical data as it relates to cannabis. Meaning today's discussion is not a debate. It is really an up-to-date discussion about how cannabis works. So we talk about THC versus CBD. We address the question of whether or not indicas versus sativas have different biological and subjective effects or not. We, of course, talk about the potential correlation, maybe even causation between cannabis use and psychosis. I think you'll find that discussion very interesting. And we talk about how cannabis relates to hunger, to memory, to anxiety, and to the treatment of anxiety. I'm certain that given the widespread use of cannabis nowadays, that you'll find the discussion to be both an informative and potentially useful one that could help guide decisions as to whether or not you or others should or should not use or avoid cannabis, as well as one that can simply inform about this very interesting compound. And of course, you'll learn a lot of neuroscience and biology along the way. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is 8 Sleep. 8 Sleep makes smart mattress covers with cooling, heating, and sleep tracking capacity. Now, I've spoken many times before on this podcast about the critical need to get sleep, both enough sleep and enough quality sleep. Now, one of the key things to getting a great night's sleep is that your body temperature actually has to drop by about 1 to 3 degrees in order for you to fall and stay deeply asleep. And to wake up feeling refreshed, your body temperature actually has to increase by about 1 to 3 degrees. One of the best ways to ensure all of that happens is to control the temperature of your sleeping environment. And with 8 Sleep, it's very easy to do that. You program the temperature that you want at the beginning, middle, and the end of the night, and that's the temperature that you're going to sleep at. And it will track your sleep. It tells you how much slow wave sleep you're getting, how much rapid eye movement sleep you're getting, which is critical. And all of that also helps you dial in the exact parameters you need in order to get the best possible night's sleep for you. I've been sleeping on an 8 Sleep mattress cover for well over 3 years now, and it has completely transformed my sleep for the better. 8 Sleep recently launched their newest generation pod cover, the Pod4 Ultra. The Pod4 Ultra cover has improved cooling and heating capacity, higher fidelity sleep tracking technology, and the Pod4 cover has snoring detection that will automatically lift your head a few degrees to improve airflow and stop your snoring. If you'd like to try an 8 Sleep mattress cover, you can go to 8sleep.com/Huberman to save $350 off their Pod4 Ultra. 8 Sleep currently ships to the USA, Canada, UK, select countries in the EU, and Australia. Again, that's 8sleep.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need and nothing you don't. That means the electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, in the correct ratios, but no sugar. Now, I and others on the podcast have talked a lot about the critical importance of hydration for proper brain and bodily function. Research shows that even a slight degree of dehydration can really diminish cognitive and physical performance. It's also important that you get adequate electrolytes in order for your body and brain to function at their best. The electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, are critical for the functioning of all the cells in your body, especially your neurons or nerve cells. To make sure that I'm getting proper amounts of hydration and electrolytes, I dissolve 1 packet of Element in about 16 to 32 ounces of water when I wake up in the morning, and I drink that basically first thing in the morning. I also drink Element dissolved in water during any kind of physical exercise I'm doing, especially on hot days if I'm sweating a lot and losing water and electrolytes. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement.com/Huberman, spelled drinklmnt.com/Huberman, to claim a free Element sample pack with the purchase of any Element drink mix. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free sample pack. Today's episode is also brought to us by BetterHelp. BetterHelp offers professional therapy with a licensed therapist carried out entirely online. There are essentially 3 things that make up great therapy. First of all, great therapy consists of having good rapport with somebody that you can really trust and talk to about the issues that you're dealing with. Second of all, that therapist should provide support in the form of emotional support or directed guidance. And third, expert therapy should provide useful insights that allow you to better understand not just your emotional life and your relationship life, but of course also your relationship to yourself and to career goals and school goals, meaning excellent therapy should also inspire positive action. BetterHelp makes it very easy for you to find an expert therapist with whom you really resonate with and that can provide the benefits that I just described. Also, because BetterHelp therapy is done entirely online, it's very time efficient and it's easy to fit into a busy schedule because it involves no commuting to a therapist's office, finding a parking spot, or sitting in a waiting room. If you'd like to try BetterHelp, you can go to betterhelp.com/Huberman to get 10% off your first month. Again, that's betterhelp.com/Huberman. And now for my discussion with Dr. Matthew Hill. Dr. Matt Hill, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Delighted to have you here because you're an expert in the biology of cannabis, a topic that many, many people are curious about for a variety of reasons. So just to kick things off, maybe we can get people up to speed on what cannabis is, a little bit about how it works in the brain and body to produce the various effects that it produces, and how some of that comes to be. And then we can dig into some of the nuance. I have a lot of questions about different types, if you will, of cannabis, the relationship to mental health, potentially to mental illness. We're going to drill into all of that. So just to kick things off, what is cannabis?
I mean, cannabis is a plant that has been around for some time. It's kind of got like a very rich history of use around the world for different cultures, for both kind of medicinal and spiritual and recreational purposes over several centuries. The plant has kind of become, I mean, in the West, it really wasn't a thing mainstream-wise until about the 60s. And then it became kind of introduced as like a drug of choice that a lot of people started using during the rise of the hippie era. And I think that was a lot of the time that cannabis got popularized. And then I'd say more recently, cannabis has, into the 90s and on, has become kind of a very heavily used drug by a large swath of people ranging from teenagers on up. In terms of what it is inside it, I mean, it's a plant with a lot of very complex chemistry and biology behind it. So there's a lot of molecules that it carries in it. We call these cannabinoids. And they come in a lot of different flavors. But the main one that's the most important one when we talk about cannabis and what drives the kind of intoxicating and what I would refer to as psychoactive effects of cannabis is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or what we call THC. And that really is what dictates, the psychoactive and intoxicating properties of the plant. And so the amount of THC that is within the cannabis plant will influence the, how high a person's going to get when they consume it. There are probably 70 to 100 and some odd other cannabinoids that are within cannabis. Most of them are at pretty trace levels, and they vary from different types to cannabis from one another. But the other one that's had a lot of attention is cannabidiol, or what we call CBD. CBD is structurally looks pretty similar to THC, but doesn't behave anything like THC. It's not intoxicating at all. I'm not sure. I would probably say it's not psychoactive in the sense that people can't tell if they're on it or not. But some people still say it's psychoactive because people claim, it can affect anxiety state or a mood state or other things. So in that context, maybe psychoactive is still somewhat appropriate of a word to use. And then there's a whole bunch of other things like cannabinol, cannabigerol, and these other minor cannabinoids, most of which we really don't understand any of the biology of. We don't know what they're doing. They may influence some of the effects of THC. They may not. But they're there, and they vary in their composition from, different flavor of different cannabis to different flavor. And then there's those other things called terpenes, which are kind of highly volatile compounds, but they're not specific to cannabis. They're found in tons of other plants. So this is a lot of which seems to contribute at least to some of the smell and the flavors of cannabis. So these are things like limonene, which, gives some cannabis kind of a citrusy odor or flavor to it. Pinene, which gives things more of like a earthy tree kind of smell. Beta-caryophyllene, myrcene, and these terpenes are also, some of which do have known biological activity, some don't, and they vary quite heavily across different kinds of cannabis as well. And again, there's some thought that they may be influencing some of the psychoactive or intoxicating properties of cannabis, but the reality is we really don't know a lot about them at this point. There's kind of some emerging work that's starting to come out now that kind of plays with, giving someone THC and adding in one other terpene or one other minor cannabinoid and seeing how it influences things. And so you can imagine with the plethora of molecules that exist in cannabis, doing this in a piecewise manner could take decades to kind of really get to a point where we understand all the interactive components of cannabis. But people tend to refer to this as like an entourage effect. That's kind of a phrase that gets used quite widely in the cannabis world. And the idea behind that is that if you took pure THC, and so there are some like distillate pens and things that exist out there now in the product market, which are basically isolated THC with trace levels of anything of other stuff, would be very different than if you had THC in combination with some of these other molecules and how they might influence how THC itself is working or not. So,
fascinating plant. You mentioned the psychoactive effects. Some people listening to this and watching this presumably have experienced those psychoactive effects. Others perhaps have not. How could we describe for both groups what the quote unquote psychoactive effects are? You mentioned the higher the concentration of THC, the quote unquote higher someone will get, right?
Yeah.
The greater the intensity of the high. What is the high? And I know people are probably chuckling, saying, does Huberman not know because he's never done it? I mean, that's my own business. I just want people to understand what you mean by psychoactive effects.
So, I mean, the way that people would usually describe the intoxicating effects of cannabis is people often refer to it as there being some euphoria or some positive mood. Not on the same order as what people would describe with, say, cocaine or some other stimulants, but there certainly is some kind of positive aspect. I mean, if there wasn't, people wouldn't be using it if they didn't feel positive about it afterwards. There can be, other aspects in terms of changes in feeding behavior. People might find things funnier than they found things. It might change the way they perceive various environmental stimuli. But it can also, for some people, create a bit of a dissociative state to some degree where people might feel a little bit out of body. So it's kind of a complicated intoxicating state to describe, I would say, because usually if someone's referring to something like a stimulant, they're just like, oh, people feel like they're God. They're like,
possibility everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're very happy and they're kind of jacked up. And I think with cannabis, the way people would describe it would be very different. It's like kind of an introspective state. You might be more aware of your bodily feelings and states that are going on inside of you, your kind of internal state, but you also have like a different perspective on external stimuli. You might process information a bit differently, focus on things a bit differently. So it's kind of a complicated state to describe, I would say. Usually when people are assessing if someone's intoxicated, like the kind of lab work where people get someone high, they just kind of use what we call a visual analog scale, which is like a 1 to 100 or something, or a 0 to 100, and say, do you feel high? Do you enjoy this? Would you say you feel euphoric? Is your mood elevated? So they're kind of scaling things like that. So I think that's more typically in a lab setting how you would define if someone's high or not from it. And this is why when people do studies with something like a placebo cannabis or a very low THC cannabis, you'll see kind of a scaling. So even if you give someone a placebo cannabis, if they think that they're getting cannabis, a lot of people still respond by saying they feel a bit high.
That's interesting. Is that true even if they've never used cannabis before?
I'm not actually certain if you are allowed to have someone in a drug study if they've never done something before. I think they have to have had some previous experience with a drug.
And they pay
to be
you, so
enrolled.
now pot smokers everywhere are running to look at
stuff. But I think, I don't think you can use drug-naive people. I mean, I don't run human clinical lab studies, so I can't explicitly say it, but that's my understanding, is that someone has to have had even limited, like, not much, but at least once or twice. They have to have experienced the drug before. So I don't know if you would take someone who was completely blind, because I don't know how they would replicate that state
Interesting.
if they're not expecting it.
What about the effects of cannabis on time perception? There's this reputation that cannabis has for disrupting time perception, that people will think a long period of time has passed when in fact very little time has passed. Maybe it's sometimes even the reverse. Is the mechanism by which cannabis can adjust time perception known?
I wouldn't say it's well worked out. There definitely seems to be some like temporal dilation, like you're saying, where people think things of, someone will be high and someone will ask them, how long do you think time has passed? They would report usually longer periods of time have passed than actually have. I feel like there is some older work I could dig up to see if I could find that is either in it might even be in pigeons, but it might be in rodents, that's looking at like temporal ordering, and they give animals cannabinoids, and that's kind of a cleaner way of seeing, because they are very good at learning, like if I wait 10 minutes and then I engage in a behavior, I get a reward. And so you can really train animals to have this ordinal timing where they kind of know distinct periods of time. And if they give them cannabinoids, they respond differently. So in that context, it does still seem to produce some state where there's an altered perception of time passing. And so I think if we were going to really understand the mechanism of it, that would probably be the way to go. But I'm not super familiar with the work, because anything I can think of is pretty old. I can't think of anything modern where people have actually looked at this.
Interesting. You mentioned effects of cannabis on appetite. And I know one of the medical uses of cannabis is in people that are undergoing treatment for cancer in order to stimulate appetite, because oftentimes they have very low or even no appetite due to the cancer treatment. Is the mechanism by which cannabis can stimulate appetite known? And if so, what is the general trend of effect? It makes people hungrier, obviously, but we hear, again, in recreational terms, of people getting the munchies, becoming exceedingly hungry. Is that related to some cannabis-induced effect on, say, blood sugar, like insulin or glucose regulation, or is it happening at a different level?
I think we almost need to take a step back, actually, to talk about how cannabis works in the brain before we kind of go into that. So
Great.
THC as a molecule exerts almost all its effects. They're acting at this one receptor, for the most part, that's widely expressed through the brain, called the cannabinoid type 1 receptor.
CB1.
Yeah, CB1 is the shorthand for it. And I think, as people tend to create analogies to describe what receptors are, for those of you who don't know, most people use like a lock and key analogy, that like a receptor would be a protein that sits on a cell, and a molecule that binds to it, like THC, is the key that fits in that lock. When it activates it, it triggers some biological process in the cell, in this case a neuron, that changes its activity in some capacity. And so THC acts on these CB1 receptors, which are very widely expressed. In fact, outside of like kind of ion channels that are expressed in the brain, the CB1 is, I think, one of the most, if not the most widely expressed receptor in the brain. It's everywhere. So it's really important. And I think as kind of you had alluded to previously, it doesn't exist in this didn't evolve in humans in the hopes that one day humans would find cannabis. This is just.
Although cannabis users everywhere use that argument.
I know people love to leverage things. If it's a plant, it's natural and safe. And there's obviously issues we'll talk about with that. But I mean, really, this is just biological redundancy. I mean, nature only has so many ways to create something. And so there's going to be things that end up overlapping in the way that they function. And so the receptor that's in the brain and throughout the body, the CB1, and there is also a CB2 receptor, it's not really expressed in the brain. It's in some of the immune cells in the brain and maybe some limited distribution in actual brain cell neurons.
Where in the body is it
It's
expressed?
mostly immune cells. So you'll see CB2s mostly on like macrophages or other kind of immune cells.
Cells that gobble up debris.
Yeah, and that basically, regulate inflammatory processes. And so the main role of CB2 seems to be much more about like regulating inflammation. So that's kind of a separate role. That can certainly impact the brain in different ways, but when we talk about the effects on the central nervous system and the brain and behavior, we're talking almost entirely about CB1. And so both the CB1 and CB2 receptors, like I said, don't exist because nature was like, humans are going to find cannabis. This will all work together now. So there are molecules our body produces, which we call endocannabinoids. And they are kind of funny little molecules because they don't really behave, like certainly in the brain, they don't behave like a normal neurotransmitter. So I mean, I assume most people who listen to your podcast are relatively adept with the basic idea of how neurons work. So you have neuron A, let's call it the presynaptic neuron, because you have that gap between the two cells where they communicate called the synapse. So neuron A releases a transmitter, and it can be something that excites the neighboring cell, neuron B, or it can inhibit it. And so the way that we always kind of talk about neurotransmission in the brain is neuron A releases a chemical that crosses the synapse, acts on neuron B, and it can either, jack that neuron's activity up or it can scale it down. And that affects, brain-wide patterns of activity. And we call that anterograde because it moves from neuron A to neuron B, which is kind of the general flow of things and how we usually think about it. So endocannabinoids are kind of this, little bit of an oddity in the sense that they could do the reverse. And so endocannabinoids are actually made in neuron B on the postsynaptic side, and then they go backwards and act on neuron A to regulate how much transmitter is released. And so in many ways, this is like, I kind of liken it to a thermostat model for the most part. Certainly if we're talking about something like excitability. So if neuron A is dumping out something that excites neuron B, like glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, as neuron B gets too excited, it's going to start releasing endocannabinoids to go back and tell neuron A to stop driving it.
So sort of a homeostatic scale and trying to maintain a middle range.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, no matter how you discuss it and what system you discuss it, I think the majority of people in the cannabinoid field would agree that the primary physiological role of endocannabinoids is to maintain homeostasis. That's what they do. They keep everything in its happy place, let's say. So like,
and that's probably why the CB1 receptor is so widely distributed, is that neurons can excite or inhibit each other, that is, raise or reduce the amount of electrical activity in the, let's say, nearby neuron, because here we're talking about retrograde signaling. But ultimately, you don't want runaway excitation, because that looks like epilepsy.
Exactly.
And you don't want runaway inhibition, because that looks like suppression of ability to think, move, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay.
So you want to keep things in where they should be. And so you want neurons to get excited, but you don't want them to get overexcited. And so endocannabinoids in kind of a very prototypical sense act as this circuit breaker, essentially, where they go back and gate how much is coming in. And they do this through various mechanisms, essentially turning off the electrical activity of that presynaptic neuron so that it stops releasing neurotransmitter. They can also regulate, though, inhibitory neurotransmitter release as well. And this is usually done through a little bit more of a complex process where it's driven by excitation, but then it regulates the inhibitory pathway.
So inhibiting the inhibitor leads to more excitation.
Exactly. I usually liken it to basically taking the brakes off of a car while you're going downhill kind of thing. Like you'd use your braking system to keep things in check, but if you want to go faster, you take the foot off the brakes and you let things accelerate. And so this can be really important for things like forms of synaptic plasticity or neuroplasticity, let's say, where you want synaptic strengthening to happen. So like under a learning event or something, you want that synapse to really hardwire better. And so having endocannabinoids kind of turn off the inhibitory component is one of the mechanisms to facilitate that. But at the same time, if you want to have a bit more adaptive flexibility, endocannabinoids can weaken that synapse at the same time by acting right at the excitatory terminal itself. And so their ability to kind of play with the relative activity of a circuit is really dependent on which neuron they're acting on. And so they can regulate excitation or inhibition differentially. And I mean, CB1 receptors are found on virtually every single kind of neuron in the brain, except one. I think you'll find this interesting because it's dopamine. And dopamine neurons are basically the only neurons in the brain that don't really, at least as far as we've been able to characterize to date, express cannabinoid receptors.
Interesting. If I may, earlier you mentioned one of the potential psychoactive effects of cannabis is euphoria. Does that mean that the euphoria associated with cannabis use is independent of dopamine and is more reliant on something like perhaps the opioid receptor system or the serotonergic receptor system?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that cannabinoids don't affect dopamine because what we understand in the ventral tegmental area, which is kind of the hot spot of dopamine neurons, or at least the ones that are involved in motivation and stuff, those neurons are regulated by a lot of inhibitory neurons that dump out inhibitory transmitter and keep those neurons kind of quiet.
So there's an opportunity for indirect regulation.
Exactly. So what you have is those neurons that regulate the dopamine neurons are very rich in cannabinoid receptors. This is actually kind of similar to how mu opioid receptors work for things like morphine or heroin. And essentially what the cannabinoid receptors will do is when they're activated, they'll turn off that inhibitory control, and that allows dopamine neurons to kind of move into a state where they're more prone to go into burst firing and have big dumps of dopamine. Whether or not that relates to, the positive affect or the euphoria, I don't think anyone has cleanly demonstrated that. I mean, obviously, dopamine's very complicated in terms of its relation to endpoints and whether it's reward or motivation. But cannabinoids definitely do have an influence on dopamine transmission. They just don't tend to do it directly. And I think that's this very bizarre and interesting component of cannabinoid signaling is why the brain would have evolved in a way to allow every other neurotransmitter system to be actively and directly regulated by endocannabinoids, but dopamine is kind of spared from this. So I don't know. No one, I mean, obviously you can always just theoretically guess as to why someone would do that. I don't know what the reason for it would be, but it is something that has kind of intrigued a lot of people because every other system in the brain is so tightly controlled to some degree by endocannabinoids, and then this one circuit is kind of free of it. So, but yeah, so the main role of endocannabinoids is really to regulate plasticity or homeostasis, allow flexibility of circuits to either goose up their activity or ramp it down if they need to, depending on the environment, depending on the experience of the organism. So there's a lot of kind of roles that endocannabinoids play in that domain. But even within the endocannabinoids, I mean, there's two primary endocannabinoids. And again, this is one of the weird things about how endocannabinoids work, because if you talk about things like serotonin or dopamine, you have a single molecule that gets released in the typical anterograde way, and it diversifies at the level of the receptor. So serotonin has like 15 receptors or 20 or something now. Dopamine has at least 5. And so the different actions that serotonin or dopamine will have is all driven by the diversification of the receptors. It's one molecule, whereas cannabinoids are the reverse. Not only do they work backwards across the synapse and work in this retrograde fashion, but really you have one receptor that is regulated by 2 molecules. So the diversification happens more at the level of the molecule than at the receptor, which is, again, very unique. And the 2 molecules that we know are kind of the bona fide endocannabinoids. There could be more. They're called anandamide, which is actually a kind of a funny name because it comes from the Sanskrit word anand for bliss. And so Rafi Meshulam, who was in Israel when he discovered the molecule, 30 odd years ago, wanted it to reflect inner bliss. And so he named it anandamide. So it's like inner bliss with an amide bond is kind of the joke he had for it. And so
he discovered anandamide and decided to call it bliss because he had familiarity with cannabis, or because he took anandamide as a direct experience.
I mean,
because it takes a lot for a scientist to discover a molecule, but then for a scientist to discover a molecule and then name it bliss for a particular reason, you have to speculate that they had some familiarity with the compound.
Rafi Meshulam was also the guy who isolated and discovered THC. So, I mean, he's kind of the grandfather of the whole cannabinoid field. So he has a landmark paper from 1964, which ironically, and this is one of these weird pop culture things, I don't know if this is true. That paper was published on April 20th, 1964. And so the joke is this where 420 came from? Because the original like birth date of the first THC paper was 420, 1964.
Well, now that potential myth is definitely going to propagate.
Yeah. But yeah, so he'd been in the field for a while, and so he had studied cannabis on that side, and then in 1990, his lab isolated anandamide as being the first molecule that activated the receptor endogenously. And so it was kind of, I think it was a little tongue-in-cheek that he named it the way he did. A few years later, the second molecule, which is just called 2-arachidonylglycerol, or what we call 2-AG, that was discovered kind of in tandem, both again by Mechoulam, but also by a Japanese group. And so we understand these two molecules don't do the same thing. Like they are a bit different. So the way anandamide binds to the receptor is it's what we would call a high affinity but low efficacy agonist, or molecule at least. And what I mean by that is very low levels of anandamide are required to actually bind to the receptor. But once it binds, its ability to stimulate a biological response in that neuron is kind of caps out pretty fast. So it doesn't have like a sledgehammer effect. Whereas 2-AG seems to require a bit more concentration in the synapse to be able to bind to the receptor. So it has a lower affinity for the receptor. But once it binds to the receptor, it's like pretty heavy duty. So it evokes a very robust intracellular signaling response. And so why we have two endocannabinoids, we're not totally sure. Some of us have theories. I'm of the camp that I think they may play somewhat differential roles, either based on the synapse or the circuit that they're working in, or this idea that maybe anandamide might be more of a tonic molecule. And what I mean by that is, we'll say it's like a stage setter. So like anandamide might just be kind of made by neurons on an ongoing basis and just released. And its job may be to kind of keep the steady state of a brain circuit in a desired range so that under resting conditions, it's not too active or too quiet.
Your thermostat analogy is perfect here.
So in that context, it kind of is like just the thermostat of the house. Whereas 2-AG is like, let's say, the pinch hitter who gets brought in to do the heavy lifting. And so 2-AG during a situation like, let's say, something like even like a seizure is an extreme example where you have a huge amount of neural activity. Those neurons that are getting heavily activated during, massive amounts of neural activity start dumping out huge amounts of 2-AG. And that acts as okay, we really need to turn off this circuit very quickly in this situation. And in most of these forms of like synaptic plasticity, like I was saying earlier, where you need to either strengthen or weaken a synapse in response to a change in the environment or in response to an experience or something that's going on, most of that is driven by 2-AG signaling. And so, all these forms of like turning things up or down in a kind of rapid and on-demand manner, that's mostly 2-AG. So most people who study like neurophysiology and like record activity in neurons and look at endocannabinoids, they're almost entirely talking about 2-AG when they play with stuff. Yeah, that's kind of one of the ways we do it. We say that anandamide may be more tonic and 2-AG might be more phasic and like brought online when needed, but doesn't do a lot. There is some evidence that 2-AG may also have a role to regulate some circuits under kind of resting conditions as well. And there certainly are some situations where anandamide might get brought into play to affect plasticity, but as kind of like an umbrella idea of how we look at it, that's often how we divide those two up. So we kind of have these two molecules. They, end of the day, do the same thing. They're regulating neurotransmitter release through retrograde signaling, but what stimulation brings them online or what drives their activity may differentiate. And we don't really understand all the details behind that, outside of the fact that we very clearly know 2-AG is activity dependent. So as that neuron becomes more active, it's going to make 2-AG to regulate its inputs. So yeah, you have this very complex system, and it's really widely distributed in, it's everywhere. The cannabinoid receptors and the endocannabinoid molecules are in the cortex, they're in the hypothalamus, they're in the striatum, the hippocampus, the cerebellum.
All over the brain.
Except the one area where it's really interesting, actually, where you don't really see much receptor is in brainstem populations that regulate kind of unconscious cardiac and respiratory function. So this is one of the things that really differentiates cannabis from opiates, because a lot of the signaling mechanisms between opioid receptors and cannabinoid receptors are quite similar. But as it's been well established, people can overdose and fatally and die from opiates relatively easily. And the way that tends to happen is when you activate the opiate receptors in the kind of cardiorespiratory parts of the brainstem, it depresses neural activity. So as the person loses consciousness, they also unconsciously will stop regulating their own heart and breathing, and it can be a fatal response. Because cannabinoid receptors don't really exist in those regions, you don't get the same kind of impact in terms of suppressing heart rate and breathing function. And so that's, there's always the saying, like, there's never been an account of someone actually dying from a cannabis overdose or a THC overdose. Certainly people can do stupid things while they're intoxicated that result in their death, but in the same manner that someone can die from consuming too much opiates, that doesn't seem to be physically possible with cannabinoids as far as we've seen so far. And a lot of that is just because of the localization. Like, for some reason, there's just not the receptors in that part of the brain. So
very interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of aficionado questions about the receptor biology. I'll just spare everyone the details by just highlighting something that you already said far more eloquently than I will, which is, I think it is fascinating that this whole system has both a tonic, like a steady release capability, and a phasic, so the ability to spike, forgive the pun, the neuroscientists will know what I'm talking about, to spike more activity of this system superimposed on that tonic activity, because this is something that you see in the dopamine system. Yeah. This is something that you see in essentially every neuromodulator, neurotransmitter system. But it seems that the endocannabinoid system has accomplished this quite a bit differently. Yeah. So very interesting, unique system in a number of ways that raise a number of key questions.
So if you go back to the munchies question you had, so if we tie into that, so there's a few ways. Cannabinoids in feeding are a really interesting thing, because if you ask people kind of the prototypical responses to consuming cannabis, most people would usually say munchies is one of the things that pops up pretty regularly. And so, the cannabinoid receptors are they are expressed in these feeding circuits in the hypothalamus. And there's a lot of complex circuitry there that can regulate food-seeking behavior. And
we just had an episode with Zach Knight from HHMI and UCSF. Where we talked about like the AGRP neurons and different neurons of the hypothalamus. We can link to that in the show note captions. Nowadays, a rich understanding of the neurons that stimulate food-seeking, craving, and then
so
eating.
We know that like cannabinoids, they regulate, again, those inhibitory inputs around AGRP neurons, for example. And so one thing they can do is disinhibit those AGRP neurons so they become more active, and that can drive food-seeking behavior. So that's certainly one mechanism of it. But there's also a huge reward component to this in terms of the munchies. And so we know that like you can also just dump an anandamide, for example. This is, Steve Mahler and Kent Berich did this work years ago, where they just put an anandamide into the nucleus accumbens, and that can also stimulate palatable food intake. So you also have this ability to integrate with the reward circuitry. And then there was also this fascinating paper from a Japanese group in PNAS, I think about 12 years ago. And what they found was they would give a rodent a cannabinoid, and then they would stimulate different taste bud populations. And then they would look at the gustatory cortical response to stimulating the populations. And what they found is, under the influence of a cannabinoid, if you stimulated sweet taste buds, you got an enhanced response in the gustatory cortex, but not if you did salty, bitter, or sour, or I don't know if they did umami in that one, but it was very explicit to sweet tasting. And so you have this kind of ability to like jack up the way the brain is processing sweet tasting foods. You have this engagement of the reward circuitry, and then you also have this ability to regulate AGRP neurons as well as the POMC neurons. There's kind of both sides to that in the arcuate nucleus to regulate multiple components of feeding. But a big question is like, my lab has become kind of interested in this as well, because we have a component of my lab that studies feeding behavior. And one of my postdocs has been doing these projects for years now, trying to understand almost like at a behavioral mechanism level what the munchies are. And what she's been looking at is we kind of started thinking about the idea that, what is it that, because it's not just food seeking, and it's not just, like just want to consume something. There's a maintenance of eating. And so we know from humans and animals, you can satiate them. You can make someone full and then get them high on cannabis, and they'll reinitiate eating. So that's an interesting thing in and of itself, because that means you're disrupting either the ability of the brain to detect satiety, or you're messing with a process we call reward devaluation. And so reward devaluation is like, if you haven't eaten for a day and you see like, a picture of a pizza, someone brings a pizza in front of you, it just looks delicious. And that first slice tastes amazing. It's salty, it's fatty, it's delicious. You eat 5 of those slices, it feels greasy and nasty. And so that process of how you perceive the food and its reward salience degrades as you eat and as your brain basically shifts into a thing of we don't need to consume calories in food anymore. We're okay. We're full now. And so we've done a series of experiments in the lab where you'd get the animals and either satiated in advance where they have already devalued the food and under a normal state, they won't eat it anymore. They won't work to get access to it. And you get them high on like a cannabis extract. We have these vape chambers that are like, I don't know how else to describe it outside of like a little hot box. It's probably the best way to this because it's essentially a kind of a locked airtight box that the rat goes in and it gets like vapor puffs and it fills up and then they inhale this and then it clears out and they get another puff and then it fills up. And we do this for like 15 minutes and we've titrated all this to get exactly blood levels of THC that you would achieve in someone who's, consuming cannabis through smoking. And so we get them to that point and then give them access to food and they will go gangbusters. They eat food. Doesn't matter what you give them. You give them plain chow. They go to town. You give them fatty. You give them sweet. They love it all. But you pre-satiate them and they get them stoned. They will reinitiate eating again. And you make them work for it where they have to like lever press. And you get them stoned and they will go to town on that and they will work. And
proof that even under the influence of cannabis, animals will work hard.
Yeah, for food, I don't know about other stuff, but for food, they certainly will. I mean, and at least Wiertz and Cassie Moore have done this at Hopkins as well. They've shown similarly using what we call progressive ratio, which is essentially a thing where it's like the first time you press a lever, you immediately get a sugar. Next time you got to hit it twice to get a pellet. Then you have to hit it 4 times to get
like
one.
life.
Yeah, then you got to hit it 16 and then and it kind of scales exponentially up. I mean, we've had this one female we kind of joke about in the lab, this one female rat, and you get her high and she'll do like 300 lever presses to get 1 sugar pellet. Like she really wants it. So you can really kind of goose up their motivation to eat. And so there's clearly a rewarding aspect to this because they're motivated to engage enough in working to get access to the food. But you can also do another way of testing this question, which is you can pair a food with something that will make the animal feel nauseous, like lithium chloride. This is kind of the way that you would test conditioned taste aversion. So you give them access to a food and then you give them something that makes them feel nauseous and the animals will avoid that food. And so that's another way to kind of devalue a food is by pairing it with a nauseant so the animal no longer likes it. So again, same situation, you can get the animal stoned and it will re-engage in eating that food that it had devalued through being paired with a nauseant. So through either satiety or making it kind of a negative associated flavor because the animal got nauseous before, you can kind of override these effects by giving THC. And so that could be a complex process that either involves changes in the reward circuitry. This could be something that's like from the orbitofrontal cortex, which is a very important part of the brain that scales reward and kind of assesses how much someone wants to work or an organism wants to work to achieve a reward at the end. So we haven't figured out the circuitry of this and where exactly it's acting, but I would say a lot of the stuff that, we and others have done kind of supports this idea that a lot of what the munchies is this ability to kind of almost lock in the reward value of food so that it doesn't decay. Despite satiety, despite eating over time, it just keeps it highly salient so that they want to work for it still. And then similarly, we and others have also done work to show it can block satiety signals. So we know endocannabinoids, at least, are capable of overriding leptin. So leptin is an anorectic molecule, comes out from the fat, and usually we release it when we've eaten a lot, and it's one of these things that tells our brain, stop eating. It works through, again, populations in the arcuate nucleus and changes the way those neurons function to drive food-seeking behavior. And we and others have shown previously that, if you elevate endocannabinoids, you can override that. And actually, one of the mechanisms by which leptin seems to suppress feeding is actually by turning on the metabolism of endocannabinoids so that their levels decline. And so as you lose that endocannabinoid function, the animal is less interested in eating. And so you can prevent these anorectic effects of leptin by like goosing up endocannabinoid activity.
As many of you know, I've been taking AG1 for more than 10 years now. So I'm delighted that they're sponsoring this podcast. To be clear, I don't take AG1 because they're a sponsor. Rather, they are a sponsor because I take AG1. In fact, I take AG1 once and often twice every single day, and I've done that since starting way back in 2012. There is so much conflicting information out there nowadays about what proper nutrition is. But here's what there seems to be a general consensus on. Whether you're an omnivore, a carnivore, a vegetarian, or a vegan, I think it's generally agreed that you should get most of your food from unprocessed or minimally processed sources, which allows you to eat enough but not overeat, get plenty of vitamins and minerals, probiotics, and micronutrients that we all need for physical and mental health. Now, I personally am an omnivore, and I strive to get most of my food from unprocessed or minimally processed sources. But the reason I still take AG1 once and often twice every day is that it ensures I get all of those vitamins, minerals, probiotics, etc. But it also has adaptogens to help me cope with stress. It's basically a nutritional insurance policy meant to augment, not replace, quality food. So by drinking a serving of AG1 in the morning and again in the afternoon or evening, I cover all of my foundational nutritional needs. And I, like so many other people that take AG1, report feeling much better in a number of important ways, such as energy levels, digestion, sleep, and more. So while many supplements out there are really directed towards obtaining one specific outcome, AG1 is foundational nutrition designed to support all aspects of well-being related to mental health and physical health. If you'd like to try AG1, you can go to drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim a special offer. They'll give you 5 free travel packs with your order, plus a year's supply of vitamin D3 K2. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Huberman. You're talking about increasing endocannabinoid activity. And we've said all this in the context of cannabis. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how the components in cannabis, THC mainly, but also CBD, impact these receptors, the CB1, and let's just leave CB2 out for the moment because it sounds like it's more of an immune system thing. But just to make it very clear, is there a way to increase the activity of endocannabinoids without ingesting THC?
Yes, I mean they dynamically change all the time. So,
but I'm talking about you're talking about experimentally or recreationally adjusting their levels. But how does one do that without using THC?
So, okay, few things there. We'll take a step back. So, THC itself isn't going to. It does its thing by acting directly on the cannabinoid receptor. So
it sort of mimics the anandamide and 2-AG. Yeah.
So. THC, going back to kind of the pharmacology of this. So THC, if you look at how it interacts with the receptor, it's not a heavy duty molecule. So, I mean, this was kind of one of the things that came up before as well, is this idea that THC is a sledgehammer and it overrides endocannabinoids.
By the way, Matt's referring to the fact that I said that in a previous solo episode about this. And there I was nesting it in the concentrations of THC that can be found in high THC cannabis.
Yeah.
So essentially what I was saying is that at very high THC concentrations, the amount, maybe not the binding affinity, but the amount of THC that is available to the CB1 receptors is going to exceed what's normally found in terms of the amount of anandamide that can bind to CB1 receptors, because what you're talking about is a supraphysiological condition.
Yeah, I mean, you don't really actually need much THC in the brain to produce psychoactivity. Like it's a little bit of a mystery, to be honest, exactly how it works. I mean, I think the main way that most people in the cannabinoid theory field would look at this is that THC is not like a very strong agonist. I mean, even if you look at its ability to trigger an intracellular response, it's much lower than 2-AG. It's actually more like anandamide.
So you said anandamide is high affinity, low efficacy.
Yeah, so THC is the same. THC is actually only a partial agonist. It's not even a full agonist at CB1.
But it is high affinity.
It's high affinity, so it has the ability. But the tricky thing with that is it can outcompete 2-AG, but because it's a lower efficacy agonist than 2-AG, in that sense, it's almost blocking the effects, not amplifying them.
Blocking the effects of 2-AG, but does it block the effects of anandamide?
THC and anandamide, the way I would visualize it is because they seem to have relatively similar affinities and efficacies of the receptor, they might, let's say, dance around. So it would be somewhat interchangeable. The difference there is, and this, I think, is the big point about what THC does versus endocannabinoids, because we know now through the pharmaceutical development of drugs that can boost anandamide levels, which exist. We have inhibitors that prevent their metabolism. We can elevate them. There's no intoxication and no psychoactivity associated with elevating anandamide.
That's a very interesting point that we should highlight. So there are drugs that now exist that can block the breakdown of anandamide, make more available, presumably by disrupting some enzymatic breakdown.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore lead to more binding of the now elevated levels of anandamide that are available to CB1, and you see no psychoactive effects.
No psychoactive.
People are not aware that
you can do, no one can guess.
What is it used for?
Well, I mean, it was developed, the first molecule really was developed by Pfizer to look at if it could work on pain. The first trial that was done did not work. It was like a kind of strange osteoarthritic knee pain trial that was like, even in that trial, the positive control of naproxen barely worked. But because the Fa inhibitor, which is, take a step back, Fa is the enzyme that chews up anandamide. So the drug that is developed inhibits that enzyme. So you prevent the enzymatic breakdown of anandamide. So we just call them Fa inhibitors. So this drug will boost anandamide levels quite high, and in animal research showed some efficacy in modulating pain. And so they put it in a trial, and it didn't work against the positive control of naproxen, which is like an NSAID, just like Advil, basically.
Aleve.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. So, and that drug didn't work that great to begin with, so it was maybe some issues with the trial, but it essentially killed the development of the drug from that point on, because everyone's like, oh, it's not going to work. So it kind of shelved for a while. A colleague of mine, Marcus Heilig and Leah Mayo, Leah's now a colleague of mine in Calgary, but at the time she was a postdoc with Marcus in Sweden, and they were able to get access to this molecule right before COVID, essentially. And they did a trial in just healthy controls with it, which, again, this is kind of jumping the gun on some of the other stuff I'll talk about, so I'll tether back to that. But what they did was they dosed people for 10 days on this drug, and then we looked at stress and fear, because this is something that I study. This is something that they were interested in. And we did find that boosting anandamide with this drug over 10 days was sufficiently capable of dampening stress-induced autonomic responses. So like looking at heart rate or skin conductance. I think skin conductance was the measure we did in there, but it's a proxy for like adrenaline release. So it blunted that, and it blunted subjective feelings of stress as well. So people had lower levels of saying they actually felt stressed. And it kind of helped remove this like conditioned fear memory that they had trained people to do. And so I worked with them on kind of doing the biochemistry of this to make sure the drug was working properly. But it was very interesting because we did see in that situation where elevating anandamide produced kind of like a reduction in stress perception, a reduction in stress physiology responses, and kind of help kind of reduce fear. And so that is kind of an interesting outcome because it tracks with some of the stuff we know about cannabis, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the PTSD stuff and anxiety later. But so that's kind of one of the things. The drug has not really been used that widely yet. It's still, it's one of the frustrations I have as a scientist who does a lot of translational work and with clinical partners like Leah, is that getting access to these molecules is not easy when they're not kind of wide, they're not like out in the market, so you can just go and get them. You really have to try and get access from the drug companies to be able to do trials with them. And so we are in the midst of trying to do that. We did just complete a trial that Leah and Marcus ran that I worked with them on as well. That was on PTSD. And so there are various potential indications for this. I mean, Johnson & Johnson developed one as well, and they looked at it in social anxiety disorder. They had some moderate efficacy in their trial. So I'd say the jury's still out on exactly what we're going to do with these, but they have some potential, I think, in certain clinical settings. We just have to figure that out exactly. But I think going back to where we started this from, they're not psychoactive. And so, I mean, when Pfizer first made the drug, they were actually initially concerned that it wasn't getting in the brain because no one could tell they were on the drug. I mean, this was the Wild West at this point. No one had any idea what endocannabinoids were actually going to do. People were basing it on what we knew about THC. So the assumption was people would have psychoactivity, but they didn't. Pfizer then actually they did a sleep study to show that it did have some effects on sleep cycle, the same way THC does. And then they also did like an in vivo PET binding study to show that they could displace a radioactive molecule that would bind to the enzyme in the brain. So
Seems like a lot of gymnastics to basically confirm what they already knew, which is that even greatly elevating the anandamide by blocking this enzymatic breakdown of anandamide leads to, at least from what I'm understanding, vastly different subjective experience than ingesting or smoking THC.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to THC.
So what's it doing?
And cannabis, like,
so I think
it seems that this thing that we call cannabis and THC are overlapping with the endogenous effects of anandamide. But here you're not talking about endogenous normal levels. You're talking about pharmacologically greatly increasing anandamide, no psychoactive effect, no euphoria, no munchies, or et cetera. Then people smoke or take an edible of THC or cannabis, and you get a vastly different set of effects. So maybe we could talk about THC and the CB1 receptor.
Yeah.
And since we're here, we might as well talk about CBD and the, I think you're going to tell us the lack of interaction with CB1 receptor, right? And what is cannabis doing at the level of these receptors? Because it makes me wonder whether or not these receptors are the whole story, or whether or not cannabis is, as you mentioned, 70 plus active molecules in there, terpenes and a bunch of other things that may modify their action, that this thing we call cannabis has many more actions than just mimicking the endogenous cannabinoid system.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the main way that we think about this is the difference between endocannabinoids and THC is endocannabinoids are going to be released in a very specific spatial and temporal manner. So
they evolved to do that.
Yeah. So there's going to be, and I think it's very clear that anandamide, for example, is not active at every synapse that has CB1. And so when we boost anandamide signaling by inhibiting its metabolism, all we're doing is amplifying anandamide signaling at the synapses it already exists. Whereas THC, when you consume it orally or inhalation-wise, and it gets into your blood and into your brain, it's just blanket activation. You're just carpet bombing the whole system indiscriminately. And so
you're introducing the ligand, the thing that binds the receptor. This is far and away different than, say, the actions of amphetamines, which are disrupting the normal biology in a way that's giving you an amplification of an endogenous mechanism.
Yes.
Right? If that was all just nerd speak for those listening, it's one, in the context of amphetamines, what you're doing is you're taking an endogenous system, a naturally occurring system, and you're greatly amplifying the amount of dopamine, the amount of norepinephrine that's available. With what we're discussing today, the endocannabinoid system seems to be producing a set of effects that might overlap with the THC effects, but THC is doing a bunch of other things. And that's because THC, and we'll talk about CBD, but at least THC is acting as the ligand. It's in some sense, we don't want to say replacing, but it's masking the effects of anandamide.
I think the problem is when you just blanket activate all the CB1 receptors in the brain indiscriminately, like you do when you consume cannabis with THC, the resulting effect is the intoxicating state. And it's probably because there's a lot of CB1 receptors in the cortex, and those are going to be differentially regulated at different times by endocannabinoids, whereas when THC hits them, all of them are going to get affected at once. And if you think of the way that I had described how cannabinoid receptors work by essentially, in its simplest form, what cannabinoid receptors do is they change the way that two neurons talk to each other. And so
you're changing all the networks simultaneously.
Yeah. So if you hit a whole bunch of networks simultaneously, you're just going to change the way that information processing and perception occurs. And I think as a consequence of that, that's what produces the intoxicating state. Not that THC is like a super duper version of an endocannabinoid, or that it's boosting endocannabinoids. It's kind of like just indiscriminately activating all the receptors, as opposed to a system that's very finely tuned to do very specific things at very specific times.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
So the analogy that I was considering using coming in here, like the difference between endogenous testosterone or estrogen versus pharmacologic testosterone or estrogen given as a therapy,
it doesn't apply.
is very different, because that's a levels issue.
Yeah.
This is a levels and an extent issue.
Yeah, this is a lot more to do with just the nature of how it hits everything, because so for example, if we talk about feeding, we know it's been established at this point that, for example, if an organism doesn't eat for a day, so you fasted, at that point, in those feeding circuits in your brain, like the arcuate area where these AGRP neurons and stuff are, you'll start seeing elevations in endocannabinoids. So endocannabinoid levels start kind of going up and up, following kind of fasting periods. And part of this is because they're trying to engage that feeding circuitry now, and they're shifting the activity of those neurons to promote food-seeking behavior, because an organism is basically like energy detecting its periphery and saying, we might be burning through our energy reserves. We should probably eat more. And so there are obviously a few mechanisms that do this. NPY is another one, and ghrelin and things like that. So there's a lot of redundancy in these systems, but endocannabinoids are just one of the molecules that seem to fine-tune the feeding circuitry. And so in states of fasting, endocannabinoids go up explicitly in that circuit. And there's some evidence they also go up in the nucleus accumbens and affect some of the reward circuitry. So they're probably driving food-seeking behavior and enhancing the rewarding aspects of food at the same time. And so that's a natural endogenous mechanism to regulate feeding based on nutritional state. THC, on the other hand, it hits the brain. Yes, some of it's going to be the intoxication, but in tandem, you're going to hit the CB1 receptors that are in those feeding circuits as well. And the consequence of that is going to be I mean, the way I kind of analogize it to people is I say it's almost like tricking the brain into thinking that you've been fasting, because you're now activating receptors that are normally activated following kind of a fasting state. And as a consequence of that, it pushes someone or an organism or human or whatever into a state of food-seeking behavior, because now food also has high reward value, and they're kind of the way that their food circuitry is responding in the brain, at least, seems to be similar to what would happen if they've been fasted. And the thought is that's why when people, when someone gets stoned, they're not like going to eat lettuce. They want high calorie food. They tend to like things that are high carb, high fat. That combo seems to be what people like when they're intoxicated with cannabis. And that comes with a lot of calories. And the point of that would be you're trying to replenish lost energy stores. And so this at least is the kind of the theory that I have about what it is that it's doing is, and I think you can make this analogy for multiple different things. If we talk about pain or stress, we can say similar kinds of things are going on, is that endocannabinoids normally do one thing, but when THC hits the brain, it's still activating these circuits in addition to everything else it hits. So you still drive that response that the endocannabinoid system normally physiologically controls, but you're almost like tricking the brain into thinking you're in that state now.
Very
and so then you go into food-seeking behavior mode.
Super interesting. Well, I have to imagine that there are many people who use cannabis not to stimulate appetite, but for other reasons. They either like the euphoria or to adjust their anxiety. What are some other known mechanisms by which cannabis can change people's psychology? Let me focus in on one particular aspect of subjective experience, which is focus. Do you think that some people use cannabis because it allows them to focus better? And I raise this specifically because I think that in the past, cannabis has had a bit of a reputation for making people spacey. You use the word stoned, kind of out of it. And yet I've heard of some potential uses for enhancing focus.
I mean, honestly, this is a bit of a tricky one to speak to because I just don't think there's good evidence for it.
Either way, or
I just don't. I mean, as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been studied in a lot of depth. I mean, there's some things, a lot of the stuff that's been done is usually more like kind of acute memory tasks, like a working memory or recall or something like this, as opposed to explicitly studying focus. Anecdotally, there is certainly a lot of people that report that. So
my understanding is that people who use cannabis have poorer certain forms of memory, but not necessarily poorer memory across the board. Is that correct?
I don't think I would say that. I don't think you could lump anything in that context. I mean, I would say the only thing you can say confidently that I would be comfortable saying is that acutely, while someone's intoxicated on cannabis, there is definitely short-term effects on memory processing. So people tend to...
Negative effects or enhancements or decrements?
I would say most of it has to do with recall or consolidation. So there does seem to be some, I mean, certainly the animal evidence is very compelling there, but again, we can talk to what some of the limitations of that are. But in humans, I would say most of the work that's been done would suggest there is some short-term memory deficits that are present during the intoxicated state. I have not seen very much compelling evidence of long-term effects that emerge, like when someone's not intoxicated, but they use cannabis somewhat regularly. I don't think there's anything compelling for that. And even in that case, like Carrie Cutler, who's at Washington State, she's done a lot of this stuff looking at cognitive processing and different kinds of memory tasks in users while they're stoned often. And within a person, either they have adapted to using it as much as they do, or they've developed some form of tolerance to it. But even in regular users, the impact on memory processing is usually not super robust. It's still there. I mean, I think the effects that are more often seen in kind of, let's say, smaller laboratory studies where they're using people who've used cannabis but aren't regular users might be a little bit more profound because they may not be, used to that state, let's say. I mean, there's certainly something we call state-dependent learning, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And this is something I remember learning about this in undergrad through alcohol. So like, someone, first time they get drunk, tries doing something, they're very bad at the task. But if every time they're drunk, they do that task, they become better at doing it under the influence. And so then all of a sudden, they regularly do this task while they're drunk and someone tests them and they don't look like they're impaired at all because they've done it so much. And so
I should just say this point has often been confused by undergraduates and others to assume that just because one can gain proficiency at a task while under the influence of a substance does not mean that you have higher proficiency at that particular task while under the influence. In fact, the way it was presented to me when I was an undergraduate was incorrect. I remember the lecturer said, and later corrected himself, I won't call him out here because that's unfair. He's not here to defend himself, but it happens in lectures, that people who studied drunk would be better off coming to the exam drunk. That is not true from what I understand.
I don't think better off, no. But they would probably score better than someone who had never studied drunk and came to the test drunk.
Correct.
Just because they had some state-dependent learning. And so I think when we're talking about, if you're talking about someone who's a chronic cannabis user, they're going to have done a lot of cognitive tasks while they're under the influence. And so if you acutely test them, the impairment you might see in them is probably less than you would see in someone who's relatively naive or a much less experienced user. That being said, I think it's relatively well established. Most people would agree that acutely intoxication with cannabis does impair memory processes in some capacity. What explicit form of memory, I don't think I could speak to comfortably, just because I'm not a memory researcher and I know there's very specific things of like episodic and declarative and whatnot. So I can't say that, but I'd say it's kind of generally, and I mean, again, you can replicate this in animals where if you train them on a task while they're under the influence, they don't seem to have consolidated that information as well. But again, I don't really think there's super compelling evidence that there's kind of long-term permanent effects on cognitive function in individuals who use cannabis. At least I've never seen anything that's replicable or reliable or stable in any way. So, yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. And also thank you for clarifying the discrepancy between endogenous cannabinoid binding and affinity for CB1 versus THC. I really appreciate that because that's something that you and I discussed in light of the solo episode I did about cannabis. And now you've made it clear that THC does not bind with much higher affinity. It's just, I think your words were, assuming high THC levels in the cannabis, carpet bombs all the networks as opposed to binding more with higher affinity at particular receptors.
Yeah. I mean, I don't actually even think it matters if it's high THC in the cannabis. I think like some people can get very intoxicated off of very, very low doses of cannabis.
Is that right?
I mean, you look at edibles, for example. I mean, this may be an interesting segue into route of administration stuff because I think it's an important point that a lot of people don't recognize is the difference between someone inhaling cannabis versus someone orally consuming cannabis is like a different game.
Yeah, let's talk about this because I know that you and I arrived at different understanding of the fastest, typical, and slowest routes of entry for THC into the system, to arrive at the brain, right? The numbers that I gave in the previous discussion about this were related to how quickly inhaled smoke moves from the lungs to the bloodstream and crosses the blood-brain barrier.
Which is very fast.
Right, which is very fast.
Yeah. I don't know if it's different than nicotine. I'm not sure. Again, I don't know if I would say that, but yeah, it's very fast.
Okay, so there may be, it may be that it is the same as nicotine. It may be that it's faster, but importantly, it can be fast, but typically, how fast is the onset of the subjective experience of somebody takes a hit off a joint or bong hit, and they start to experience the subjective effects of euphoria, et cetera. How quickly after?
2 to 5 minutes, I would say. It's pretty fast. Minutes. I mean, so this is one of the things with cannabis is. And again, this will kind of go into this idea of the change in potency of the plant as well. It's pretty quick, and people titrate cannabis pretty well. Like, at least people who've used it a couple times and understand this.
I've seen some people not titrate it very well.
Depending again on how you. So again, this can vary. So like, cannabis from the 70s was like, I don't know, 5% THC, let's say. It was pretty low. And nowadays, cannabis is, a lot of the commercial stuff is between 20 and 30, although whether those are super accurate numbers, not entirely clear, but so it's gone up a fair amount.
Yeah. I mean, that's not just a fair amount. If we were talking about alcohol concentration.
It's beer to vodka. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basically, you're talking about a beer or a wine to a spirit.
And there are aquavit varieties, so to speak. By the way, I think when people hear me talk about any kind of drug that can be used recreationally or alcohol, I think some people assume that, I'm ultra anti all these things. I'm actually not, right? I'm not an alcoholic, so I can drink a little bit, and I just don't tend to. And we could discuss cannabis in a different venue. But the point here is we're not trying to frame this as what people should or shouldn't do. We're just trying to inform people.
No,
I want to be very,
exactly.
very clear about that. So, but when I hear about, 20 to 30% concentration as opposed to, 5% concentration, that's significant.
So I would say this is what's super interesting. And this was something that came out of the way that cannabis research is done, certainly in the States. Mm-hmm. And Canada's been quite behind on this, even with legalization. We haven't caught up. But they have been doing lab-based studies of cannabis. Meg Haney, Harriet DeWitt, this cluster of researchers around the country, Ziva Cooper at UCLA here, have all done this where, you have people come into the lab, you give them cannabis, you measure subjective outcomes or neuroimaging outcomes or whatnot. So to do this, you can't use commercial cannabis. And even like the state by state legalizations hasn't changed this. So if you are doing cannabis research in humans and you're funded by like NIDA, which is National Institute of Drug Abuse, you get all your cannabis sourced. I mean, this may be changing. I think there are some shifts that are happening, but historically, and all the literature that we would talk about that's kind of pre the last couple of years, all that cannabis came from one source, which was, I believe, a farm in like Mississippi that was essentially funded by NIDA to produce cannabis.
Lucky farm.
And the cannabis that came out of it, though, and this is one of the reasons a lot of the clinical stuff, people have kind of been like, oh, I don't know how representative this is, because it reflects cannabis that I would say is more from like the 70s or 80s. So it would be like 5 to 9% kind of THC cannabis. Now, when you put someone in a lab setting and you get them to smoke to level of intoxication, people would take, 8 tokes, let's say, something like that. And that's where they would stop. And so, a lot of the labs that use this have always been like, our people who are regular cannabis users are getting high off of it. It's not as potent as the stuff that's on the street, but they're clearly getting intoxicated from it, and it's giving us reliable data. So when they started looking at the blood levels of THC that you achieve, it was around 100 nanograms per mil of THC, give or take. That seemed to be where it was. Now, because of the way that you can legally study cannabis in the States, you couldn't just go down to a dispensary and buy the products that everyone on the street are using, which is kind of like, it's been a weird thing for a lot of people because they're like, why wouldn't you study what we're using? But because of the legal aspects of this, you couldn't bring those products into the lab. They'd never been standardized. No one knew exactly what was in them, pesticides, all this other stuff that could influence it. So from a safety perspective, it was always like, no, you use the cannabis that's sourced from NIDA. Mm-hmm. So there's a group in Colorado, it's Kent Hutchinson and Angela Bryan and Cinnamon Bidwell have kind of, I would say, became very creative actually to figure out how to study cannabis that's being used, I call it in the wild, like in kind of an ecological setting, let's say. And so they created what was called the Cannavan. And the Cannavan was a way to study people using products on the street, but not have them come into a laboratory setting where it was complicated. And so what they would do is they would drive the Cannavan to someone's house, but they'd be parked on the street, and someone would use the product, whatever it was, in their own property on their own time, and then come into the Cannavan to have blood taken to look at what their THC levels are and to undergo testing. And so it was actually like, I think this was a great advance in the field because it was this huge innovative approach that allowed us to start comparing what we've learned from lab-based settings with this kind of old school weed that was coming from NIDA with what is being used on the street.
I love this. I mean, as somebody whose lab has done a in-laboratory VR-based experiment on human anxiety and fear, and then compared that to, a clinical study that we did sort of en masse, where people were at home doing specific respiration practices. You have many more subjects, but of course they're reporting back their effects. You can monitor them by device, look at HRV, look at heart rate, et cetera. I think having the ability to compare and contrast in laboratory and ex laboratory data is extremely valuable.
Yeah, and I mean, my view is you need both because you need the in-laboratory for the control because we all need control over various things, but you also need the ecological validity to see how it shakes out and make sure it looks the same.
Yeah, for people that have never been to a laboratory or tried to find a parking spot at a university, that's an anxiety-inducing experience in of itself.
A novel experience while someone's intoxicated with cannabis can also create a very different altered state.
I wouldn't want to be stoned in a laboratory. I'll tell you that much.
I feel like there's pluses and minuses to both sides, but I think the data together is very compelling, and that's where we get a lot of advance in the field. So what Kent and Angela and Cinnamon did with the Cannavan was kind of create this situation that allowed this research to occur. And what we found fascinating, I remember talking to Meg Haney about this because all the people in her lab studies tended to always hit around 100 nanograms per mil using this relatively lower potency cannabis. When Kenton and Angela and Cinnamon started studying this in the people and taking blood, despite the fact that these people are now using cannabis that's 20 to 30%, their blood levels are the same. So they're still coming in around 100 nanograms per mil because people are really good at self-titrating. Mm-hmm. Now, where things fall apart is with the concentrates. So then you go into things like dabs or these like high potency products that are now like, because cannabis itself, realistically, from what I understand from the botanists that I've talked to, you can't really grow a plant that's going to exceed more than 25 to 30% THC just by sheer biology. So it taps out there. That's about as high as it's going to go. Concentrates can go up to like 90, 98%. So you can get really, really...
These are tinctures?
Distillates, like, various just in oil-based forms that are very, very high potency products. Those are incredibly challenging to titrate. Like they cannot be titrated because the sheer volume of THC that hits the system, even from a single hit, is so overwhelming. And so when the Colorado group looked at those, their blood levels were closer to 200, 300 nanograms per mil. So with cannabis plant, there does seem to be this ability for people to relatively self-titrate. And then my buddy Ryan McLaughlin, who's also at Washington State, he was really one of the ones that pioneered these vape chambers in rats and created this really cool model of self-administration, which was like a very important thing to actually establish because it was very challenging to get rodents to self-administer cannabis if you were doing like an IV approach or something else because they found it quite aversive. But when you let rodents actually titer their ability to get vape hits, they will like work for this the same way they will other reinforcing drugs. So it was a really important finding that you could do this. And what Ryan found was he actually did one study where he gave them access to a low potency product, we'll call it medium, and then a high. And what you ended up, if you look at the data, is the one the rats liked the best was the medium potency product.
Interesting.
And if you gave them the high potency product, they would actually take less vape hits off that than they would off the lower ones. And again, all their blood levels tended to cluster in the same range because they titrated. Like even at the rodent level, they're able to titrate because of the lag between inhalation and feeling the effects is only on the order of a couple of minutes. People can titrate better. I mean, not just people. It seems like the rodents can as well. So the higher potency cannabis, where it becomes a problem is if someone's highly inexperienced and they consume a whole bunch of it without allowing that time lag to occur. And then they can probably exceed the levels they intended to and consume too much and then have probably an adverse response.
So does that mean that cannabis use rarely leads to tolerance of cannabis use?
I wouldn't say that. There's definitely some degree of tolerance. The tolerance is definitely more prominent when people start using concentrates. There's no question about that. I mean, we can talk about the concentrates, I guess, separately after. Because I would say if we're talking about a harm reduction thing, that's more where we need to focus a lot more is this idea of these high potency products.
Yeah, it sounds like those are precarious.
Yeah.
That somebody who thinks they have a lot of experience or God forbid, no experience, takes a concentrate and is no longer getting the euphoric experience that they anticipated, but instead are getting a paranoid anxiety attack.
I think you're far more likely to go overboard and have an adverse response. But also, I think the problem is if you're using a product of that potency and that much THC floods your system on a regular basis, the biological changes from that are going to be very different than what you get if, again, you're titrating your THC from inhaling plant at roughly the same level, whether that's a 10%, 5%, or 25%, people generally tend to scale.
This is a very important point, and I'm going to highlight it because I think it's very, very, very important, although you're making it very clearly already, which is these days we hear a lot about the quote-unquote problems with high THC containing cannabis as relative to what was present in the 70s and 80s and presumably 90s as well.
Yeah.
I was a teen in the 90s, so maybe I'm alluding to something there. But what you're saying is that unless one is talking about concentrates, that people and animals in the laboratory will self-regulate the amount of intake in a way that leads to approximately the same blood levels of THC. So it may not be as much of a concern, at least in light of the concerns about, these levels are so high that people are overwhelming their system with THC. Basically, this could be stated in real world terms as people are taking fewer tokes of the higher concentration stuff that allow them to match blood levels that were present in the person taking many more tokes in the 70s.
So the joke I always make to people is they say, go watch a Cheech and Chong movie from the late 70s. Look at the size of the joints that they smoke in movies like that relative to what you would see someone on the street consuming nowadays. Like, it's just, I mean, so the advantage that existed from a titration perspective was with like 70s weed, there's a large window to titrate. So people could, take small amounts and not overconsume, let's say, because there was a much lower concentration of THC in the plant. So they're able to consume, even if they were doing it relatively fast, because of how little THC was coming into the system, it was a little easier to scale that. So there certainly is the propensity for people to overconsume higher potency cannabis, even independent of concentrates, if they're not allowing that titration to occur. Also, if you have someone who is just exquisitely sensitive to THC for various reasons, even 1 or 2 tokes could be too much for them, because at the higher potency, they may not have that ability to titrate quite as well. And so a lot of people, anecdotally, you talk to people about cannabis, and a lot of people who don't like cannabis have said, I've tried, the new stuff's too strong. And if there's someone who's kind of more in our age range, who grew up in an earlier decade where things were a bit different, they may be referencing their own experience from when they were younger and what they were able to consume, and now they try doing the same and it hits them like a sledgehammer.
Got it.
So it's a little different in that sense, but, and I don't think it's to say it's like not concerning that cannabis is as high as THC as it is. I just think if I'm going to put my efforts into kind of like, public health perspectives of this, I would be digging my feet in much more about the access to concentrates and the issues and the potential harms that are going to come with them than I would about the cannabis flower myself. That's just my opinion based on what I see with the concerns and what we've seen from the data in humans. And I think the real world ecological studies that the Colorado group have done have been very informative in this sense, because if the blood levels of THC you achieve from concentrates are double to triple of what you get even from higher potency flower, that's a concern. Like, I think that's where problems start arising, because then you're going to start seeing a lot higher degree of tolerance. I mean, there used to be more of a debate in the field as to whether people develop tolerance, because one of the things with cannabis that I do find very interesting is with a lot of chronic users, they don't escalate the way you would see with cocaine or alcohol, where there's very profound tolerance that develops. And so, I mean, people definitely see this in cocaine, where people can become tolerant almost immediately. And so dosing starts scaling up very fast.
Yeah, usually it's the life destruction that thwarts their progressive increase. Seriously.
Or the cost.
Right,
I mean, the sheer cost.
Another form of life deterioration.
Yeah, that is required to be able to maintain that. But with cannabis, it seems like there is some degree of tolerance that people exhibit. It varies from person to person. But, as Meg has said to me many times, the guys that come in her studies, these are very heavy users. And then, they will use this relatively low potency product and still get high off of it. And so it's not to say that there's no tolerance. It's just, it's not as profound as I think we see with a lot of other drugs. And this is probably due to the fact of just like, we definitely see, like if we look at some PET imaging studies, chronic cannabis users do have some downregulation.
Sorry, I have to interrupt. PET, positron emission tomography, not PETs. Although people get their pets high, and we don't know what those pets think about that.
Not good. Don't get dogs high.
If also high, one can assume a lot of things about what your pet is thinking while also high. Sort of half joke there. But yes, positron emission tomography is one way to assess the binding of drugs within the brain, as well as activity of endogenous neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, such as anandamide, dopamine, et cetera.
So a typical PET study in a human looking at this, they'd give a molecule that's radio labeled that will bind to CB1 receptors. You can scan them and then look at the emission rates of the radiation to get an idea of the density of receptors that are in the brain. Chronic cannabis users tend to have less. What that means in terms of the functional outcome is unclear. I mean, there could be some, I think there's a lot of evidence that there's some degree of a reservoir of CB1 receptors, that, there might be a lot more receptors there than we necessarily always need or are always using, let's say. So we might be downregulating a component of this, but maybe not all of the ones that are required to produce the psychoactive effects, because there's clearly some maintenance of the system that allows someone to continue to get intoxicated. And so with cannabis users, we do see that. But you do see much more profound tolerance with people using high potency extracts and concentrates and things like this. And again, surely I think as a response to the biology of hitting the system that heavily with that much THC as it comes in because they can't titrate it the same way.
It makes sense. Yeah, these concentrates sound like something to at least pay attention to as a potential problem. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you reach your health goals. Now, I've long been a believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. Now, a major problem with a lot of blood tests out there is that you get information back about metabolic factors and hormones and lipids and so forth, but you don't know what to do with that information. With Inside Tracker, they make it very easy to know what to do with those numbers because they have a personalized platform that allows you to see the levels of those metabolic factors, lipids, hormones, etc., and they give you specific directives that you can follow related to nutrition, behavioral modification, supplementation, and more that can help you bring those numbers into the ranges that are optimal for you. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 10% off their new membership program. Inside Tracker membership offers significantly reduced prices on Inside Tracker's comprehensive blood panels. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 10% off. Along the lines of use, tolerance, etc., is cannabis addictive and or habit forming? And I think it's probably important that we distinguish between the two. I may have made this joke in the previous episode I did on cannabis. I've known a lot of chronic cannabis users, and none of them admit to being addicted. It's not my place to challenge them on that, but they do seem, in my experience, this is not an experiment, but in my experience, more irritable when they don't have access to what they call their quote unquote medicine.
Yeah.
So, that speaks to a dependence or something. But then we need to be careful because in the classic sense, addiction, I've defined, and others in the field of addiction have defined it as a, progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure such that, it causes disruption to other areas of life. Your life becomes maladaptive.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to play with the definition of addiction. I feel like I have enough friends in the addiction space that it's a very contentious field. So, I mean, I will try and not use that word, although I understand talking to the general public, that's kind of, if you say someone has a use disorder versus an addiction, that may not make sense to them.
Right, but that's the nomenclature now that people are using. Yeah. Alcohol use disorder,
exactly. So,
cannabis use disorder. Yes. This is what you start to see now instead of saying being addicted to pot or being addicted to alcohol.
And so, I mean, an addiction is obviously a very complex thing that, again, I don't want to touch it simply because it's not my space. But that being said, there's no question that people can develop cannabis use disorder. I mean, it's definitely a thing. So if we say, is cannabis addictive in kind of a, normal lay speak, I would say, yes, it is addictive. What does that look like? How does that relate to other substances of abuse? I mean, certainly, the outcomes associated with it are going to be slightly different than something like opiates or alcohol, because that's a totally different beast. Because you have fatality potential, there's a whole bunch of other health consequences. But if we look at how we would define a use disorder, the criteria for someone hitting cannabis use disorder is really no different than how someone would hit alcohol use disorder or opiate use disorder, in the sense that it can consume their life, it can shift the way that they behave, they can put themselves in risky positions to get access to a drug, it can consume their time and their energy to have it. Like you said, if they don't have access to it, it can trigger, an assembly of behaviors that looks like irritability, anger, frustration, things like that. So, I mean, the numbers in terms of the conversion rate of use to developing use disorder, I would say, are not entirely clear. The kind of old numbers that used to get tossed around were like 9 to 11% of people that would start initiating cannabis use would probably transition to develop use disorder. The more modern numbers, I would say, if we're looking at people who are already using weekly, we're talking probably closer to 30%. So it's a much higher. I mean, when you're using that frequently, then the rates of people who would qualify as having cannabis use disorder probably go higher.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding clearly. For people that use cannabis weekly, the propensity for developing cannabis use disorder is on the order of about 30%.
Yeah, I'd say in that neighborhood, they would probably qualify as meeting criteria for a cannabis use disorder.
Because weekly doesn't seem like that often.
No, I mean, it depends again on how you vary this. I've had a lot of conversations with the public, and I think depending on someone's experience in their own or in their own inner circles, life with cannabis, the way they would view it is very differently. Because I think a lot of people, you know, again, regardless of anyone's opinion of alcohol, if someone told you they had a glass of wine with dinner every night, I don't think people would say you have an alcohol use disorder. I think that's not uncommon.
No, I don't think they would.
Similarly, if someone had a brandy at the end of the night or like, you know, a nightcap to go to bed and they did that on a nightly basis, I don't think anyone would say that they have a use disorder. And I think with cannabis, there are a lot of people that kind of fall into that bracket that would use it, you know, even daily, but relatively infrequently and kind of as an end of the day thing. I think some of them certainly would fall into the criteria of cannabis use disorders, because if you start looking and say, well, you know, if you travel to like Egypt, are you going to go put yourself at risk of going to jail to get access to cannabis because you can't function without it? If you do, then yeah, you know, you've got cannabis use disorder. You know, are you going to burn relationships? Are you going to start failing at meeting responsibilities or getting things done on time because you're preoccupied with cannabis? Yes, you're going to hit the criteria for cannabis use disorder. If it's someone who's kind of just intermittently using it the same way that a lot of people casually use alcohol, I would say a lot of them probably wouldn't hit criteria. But I think to someone who has never had cannabis in their inner circle or in their life, they look at it like a drug like cocaine, whereas they're like, wow, if you were using cocaine on a daily basis, we'd be super concerned about you. And so I think that's this like, it's just as you go, I mean, cannabis is in this really weird transitionary period, I would say, of going from illicit to not, just because of the changes in the legal regulatory framework. I mean, in Canada now, we're like 5.5 years into legalization. So in many ways, I would say the transition has happened where a lot of people view cannabis very similarly to alcohol, whereas you go to some states and the perspective is still very different. Certainly, if you're still in one of the states where there's no legal access, people still look at cannabis the same way they look at a lot of other illicit drugs like cocaine or amphetamines or things.
That's interesting. I was under the impression this had really changed over the last, 5-10 years. Growing up, it was, I mean, I think there are still people in jail now because of possession and sale of cannabis. And then, of course, there are stores not far from here where people are selling cannabis.
Ironic, yeah. Sadly. It's obviously a big push for legalization is not endorsement of the safety of cannabis. It's more the harms associated with prohibition outweigh the harms associated with legalization. I think that's generally the public health perspective. That's certainly what motivated it in Canada. And there was some attempts, let's say, at restorative justice in terms of removing criminal records and things. May not have been entirely as successful as people had hoped it would be, but it certainly has changed things. I mean, we can look at our federal data and see that arrest rates related to cannabis are obviously very low compared to what they were. That obviously becomes very important because there are clearly minoritized communities that get hit more with this than other communities. And so the kind of perpetual disenfranchisement that happens with a prohibition model in communities that are already suffering from various other things that affect them just potentiates all that. So I can understand the legal framework behind why there would be a move to a legalization state over a prohibition state, which again, a lot of people confuse legality with safety, which is a weird, alcohol is the perfect example of this. I mean, you look at the scale of harms on a public health level, alcohol stacks at the top. It across the board in terms of harms to the individual, harms to society, it's a lot. Cannabis has harms, there's no question on that. It just would fall lower than alcohol. But the way that people view it, a lot of people are like, alcohol is legal, therefore it's safe, and it's not something to judge people on. Cannabis, at least historically, was illegal, and in some states still is. So people view it very differently. And I think it's an interesting thing because I feel like, despite the fact that some people hate the government and hate the way that it regulates their life, there's this weird tacit belief that, like, if the government dictates something is legal, that means it's safe.
Is the legalization of cannabis leading to more cannabis users or fewer, and/or incidents of people going into the emergency room suffering from cannabis-induced psychosis, something that I hope we can also talk about?
Yeah. So it depends on how you break this down. So what we've seen in Canada is, I would say there's like demographic differences. Proportionately, when we look at the biggest change in use, it's actually elderly communities. It's like 55 plus, especially women over 55 tend to be
more cannabis use.
More cannabis use. Now, granted, their baseline was quite low pre-legalization. So if you look at a fold change, it looks like a very dramatic increase. Raw numbers, it's probably not that high, but I mean, it was like 1% to 2% or something before, and now it's gone up to like 8% or something. So it's a fourfold increase kind of thing. So we do see the magnitude of that seems to be the biggest in terms of where the uses come from. Definitely the young adult population, like 20, 24, that group has definitely seen increased use as well.
Does it split male, female?
Historically, cannabis tended to be more male biased. I would say the gender separation there has kind of narrowed quite a bit, where you do see a lot more, like more females used than historically had. There is a little bit of difference. Females tend to prefer edibles over males. So males tend to like inhalation over females. So like routes of administration vary a little bit based on who someone is. But yeah, interestingly, we don't have a lot of actual indication that teenagers have used more. So like, you look at 14 to 18-year-olds, that has been, now granted, our baseline going in was pretty high, as is down here in the States. I mean, Canada and the States both hover, you look at like grade 12ers and, it's somewhere between 35 and 40% of them have used cannabis. Now, I mean, you even have some that are like probably around 5% are probably almost daily users. So like you do have a pretty high baseline to begin with in that group, but that has remained relatively unchanged. If anything, some of the states when they legalized saw slight dips in teenage use of cannabis. So I think like that's obviously an important demographic to have tracked. This was one of the concerns with legalization was you'd increase access. Teenagers would get it from their parents and whatnot, or had just other siblings and stuff, and so you get this big boost in consumption. But we don't seem to see that in terms of raw numbers of teenagers who are using cannabis. So that's good. ER visits. So we did an interesting rollout in Canada. We legalized flower for a year before edibles came online. So we have kind of a before and after. Once edibles became available, there was a notable increase in unintentional pediatric consumption that resulted in ER visits because kids would, a lot of these look like gummies and candies. People are buying them, not, storing them properly. Mm-hmm. Kids would find them and eat them and like become very intoxicated.
I want to make mention of something along those lines. I actually know somebody whose child accidentally ate THC containing gummies. Fortunately, the child was fine. But there are actually pretty serious ramifications for this. The parents actually are quite susceptible to legal action if this happens. Right. So this is something to really keep in mind. I mean, there are a million other health-related reasons why this is probably.
I don't know if that's true in Canada the same way, but in the States.
Yeah, like if your kid gets into a stash of THC-containing gummies and ends up in the emergency room, there will also be most likely there'll be a police visit to that emergency room also, and it doesn't bode well for the parents.
So
it's a very serious issue.
Yeah.
And again, this was highlighted to me by someone that I know who didn't anticipate any of this, but kids are good at finding candy.
Yeah.
And if that candy contains THC and they end up in the emergency room, serious issues. Nonetheless, if your kid is acting strange because you think they ingested THC containing anything, take them to the emergency room anyway.
Well, so this was one of the things that also was influenced by legalization is in Canada, like some of the increase in the ER visits was because of the shift in legalization and the change in policy. And so if your kid ends up drunk underage, it's not the same ramifications as if your kid used an illegal substance underage. And so people are, once cannabis was legal, people were more likely to actually go into the ER because the consequences were different.
I see.
And so, sure, some of this is availability and some of it is just like, okay, I'm not as concerned now about something happening because I've taken my kid in. Like I'm not going to have my kid taken away from me or whatnot. So there is, both those factors I think have contributed to it, but we definitely see the majority, at least, of kids ending up in the ER is almost all based on edibles. I can't imagine a situation where that would happen from inhalation. It would be very rare if it would. It's almost always edibles because kids find them.
So as long as we're talking about edibles, is there any fundamental difference between the dose regulation that you talked about earlier of inhalants versus edibles? Meaning earlier you said that even if it's high THC containing cannabis, people will self-regulate to achieve approximately the same blood concentrations. Yeah. But with edibles, I imagine you eat half a cookie, a quarter of a cookie, and you can end up in a vastly different place than you expected.
So edibles, so this throws a wrench in the whole system. And I'll say this in the context of blood levels and then what that means from a regulatory capacity as well, because of the impact this has. So edibles are very low doses for the most part. I mean, in Canada, at least, you cannot buy a pack of edibles. And I think this law might be changing, at least when they first brought it in. No pack could have more than 10 milligrams of THC in it. So that either meant 1 10 meg gummy or 2 5 meg gummies or 4 2.5 meg gummies. You get it. So you couldn't in one package have more than 10 milligrams of THC. Now, for people who are, I would say, relatively naive to cannabis or THC, even people who might use it intermittently, most people will feel 5 milligrams. Like they'll feel some form of intoxication. You know, some will even feel it at 2.5 megs. Most people will feel it at 5. Virtually everyone will feel it at 10. Now, if you look at the blood levels these produce, we're now talking blood levels of 2 to 5 nanograms per mil. So folds lower than what you get from inhalation.
Right, before you said 100.
Yeah. So this is dramatically lower. And so also the time course of this is fundamentally different. So oral consumption, you know, you're looking at a minimum of 30 to 45 minutes for onset of intoxication. For some people, up to 90 minutes after they've eaten. Now, this is also the reason why the majority of adverse events that happen with cannabis happen with edibles, because people don't understand this. And so they eat a cookie or a gummy. They wait half an hour, like, I'm not feeling anything. I clearly didn't take enough. And then they'll double their dose. And then like 15 minutes later, it starts hitting them. And then like once it fully kicks in, it's just like a steamroller. Like,
I've heard of this happening.
Yeah. I mean, there was that New York, I think it was Maureen Dowd, someone went down to Colorado and she ate like an insane amount of THC in a chocolate bar, something like 50 or 100 milligrams, and spent like the weekend on the floor of a hotel room being like, this was the most aversive experience. Why would anyone do this? And again, I think people just don't understand the dosing around this. And so this is one of the things we're trying to do in Canada. And I was create this idea of standardized dosing units so that people have like we do with alcohol. Like we always say 1 beer is the equivalent to 1 glass of wine versus, you know, like a shot of tequila or something, so that there's some comparative that people understand how many drinks are, you know, you say 2 drinks you're going to hit legal limit kind of thing.
Yeah, seems very important.
Yeah. And so this is very difficult to do with cannabis because the dosing with oral consumption is just a different ballgame than it is with inhalation. But what happens with oral consumption is like it kind of very slowly leaks out of the GI tract. And it also goes through first pass metabolism in the liver. And what happens there is you get a metabolite called 11-hydroxy-THC, which seems to be a bit more potent than THC is in terms of its ability to activate the receptor. So, and its efficacy, at least at driving a response through CB1 receptors, seems to be higher than what you would get with just the parent molecule of THC itself. And it seems to accumulate a lot more as well. So at any given time, you know, you've got THC kind of leaking out of the gut, going through the liver, making 11-hydroxy, and it progressively accumulates in the brain. And that's one of the reasons why it takes, 45 to 90 minutes to kick in. But then the high itself also lasts like 6 hours, 4 to 6, sometimes 8, depending on the person, what they've eaten, versus inhalation is just this like spike. So you get this very rapid because it goes right through the lungs into the blood, goes into the brain, but it also clears out. And so, yeah, people will start feeling intoxicated 2 to 5 minutes. The peak high is like 15 to 30 minutes maybe from consumption, and then they'll start to come back down. And you will still see some indications of intoxication that can go on for 3 to 4 hours, but the bulk of the intoxication from inhalation is done by 2 hours for the most part.
As long as we're on the topic of time course, based on what I was able to find, I believed, and tell me if I was wrong, that cannabis can stay in one's system for as long as 80 days. The reason I brought this up previously was there are a number of people who have used cannabis, are going to take a drug test, and want to know how fast it can clear from their system. But based on conversations we had offline, sounds like that 80 days might be a bit too long.
I mean, you could still fail a drug test at 80 days. I would say, I think the way it was worded more, it was like that, you made it sound like that was the standard. I wouldn't say that was the standard at all. I would say for the majority of people, 30 days, probably after that, they would not pass, or they would be able to pass a drug test. But
so abstinence for 30 days.
Yeah, after abstaining for 30 days. And it's going to be highly variable depending on how much you consume. I mean, if you're talking about someone who's used it once, I don't imagine it would be in your system that long. That'd be surprising. The thing is, THC is a lipophilic molecule.
It's fat soluble.
Yeah, so it's fat soluble. It likes to store itself. It doesn't like the blood. The blood is aqueous and watery. It likes fat. So it goes into the brain, it goes into the fat, and it kind of resides there. And it can essentially kind of slowly leak back out as THC concentrations in the blood would reduce. THC that's in the fat will start kind of leaking back into the blood still. So detectably, you will still have THC for quite some time. I mean, some of this, again, it's going to be dependent on how much cannabis someone's used, how much THC they've consumed, how long it's been in their system for. I would have thought this was going to be somewhat reflective of people's body fat content, although talking to colleagues who do this, they say not always. But we do know, certain things like exercise, for example, anything that's going to trigger adrenaline, because adrenaline is lipolytic. So adrenaline causes fat to metabolize and release stuff that's inside it. So there are plenty of cases I've heard from people where they were testing themselves and were negative and then went for a run or went to the gym and then tested positive.
Or lost weight.
Yeah, or they've lost weight. And anything that's going to cause the lipolysis to occur so that it releases that THC, you can certainly all of a sudden test positive again when someone had tested negative previously, just because of the fact that there still is some in the fat. And so this is where something like, and this is what I mean by standardization of regulatory issues become very complicated, I remember right when legalization happened in Canada, all these kind of chemists were like, talking to me about they're going to create like a breathalyzer for cannabis because this way they'll be able to do roadside detection the same way they could do with alcohol. And I kept trying to say to them, I'm like, the rate limiting step here is not the science of detection thresholds. It's the biology of how the body processes cannabis. And you're never going to get a test that works because you can take someone who has eaten an edible and is profoundly intoxicated, and they will have possibly under 5 nanograms per mil of THC in their blood.
But you were talking about this metabolite that can come from the edibles that doesn't come from inhalants that can have a much more potent effect.
You get a bit of it from inhalant, but not nearly as much as you get from edibles.
So it's sort of a different situation altogether.
It is, but it's also the timeline because of the fact that with inhalation, it's like a bolus that hits you at once. So you get a high blood level. With edibles, it's like the time course. So, I mean, it's going to be like 5 nanograms per mil, let's say, but it would be like that for a long time. Whereas the 100 nanogram per mil from smoking is like for 20 minutes, and then it starts dropping. So, but the problem is with the way that you detect it is you can take someone who's a chronic cannabis user and is completely sober and hasn't consumed in a day or two, and their basal levels of THC in their blood may be higher than someone who's profoundly intoxicated by an edible. Just by the sheer nature of the fact that it would reside in their fat tissue or their brain, it would leak back into the blood. And so you have this issue where let's say your cutoff was 5 nanograms per mil, which is for some of the stuff, detection thresholds would hover around that area. So you could have someone who's dead sober that tests positive and someone who's profoundly intoxicated who tests negative. So it's like, what's the value in this? Right. It's not telling us anything.
Well, I guess it sounds like the drug tests either have to be revised or discarded. And it also sounds like if somebody is going to take a drug test for cannabis and they have used cannabis in any form in the previous 90 days, let's say, going for a run right before your test is going to liberate whatever THC resides in the fat stores.
Potentially, yeah. So, okay. I mean, it is complicated.
A lot of people are writing this down. Along the lines of what's known and not known, I'm curious what is known and not known about the effects of cannabis, THC in particular, on hormones. I've seen studies that cite increases in testosterone from cannabis use. I've seen studies that cite increases in estrogen from cannabis use, and they argue for increased aromatization of testosterone into estrogen as the mechanism. I've also seen studies that say the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So is there any global takeaway message yet, or is it just highly variable, or it depends too much on dose and individual age, et cetera, that we just really can't say?
I would say it's there's nothing that's super clean cut. I mean, I know in the previous podcast you talked about a prolactin thing,
right? Well, there's and this is where I think it's important that people understand that, you know, on this podcast we cover science and studies, but we also pull from common experience that people want explained if we can. And one of the experiences that is talked about a lot in certain, let's just say online communities, is the experience of people who had no pre-existing gynecomastia, male breast development, will smoke marijuana. Do we call it marijuana these days?
No. We'll go with cannabis.
I got a lot of comments that said marijuana is an inappropriate term. Okay, smoke. We'll go back to that. I that was new to me. I didn't know, so forgive me if
no,
I
no,
didn't know.
I mean, I understand it, but a lot of people don't know.
Okay, so we'll smoke cannabis and experience gynecomastia, or in females. So males and females both have breast tissue, but in males it's typically it's not hypertrophied, but they'll smoke cannabis and get a gynecomastia, growth of the male breast tissue. That's sometimes reversible, sometimes not, presumably through the aromatization of testosterone into estrogen, which then acts on the tissue, makes it grow, as well as reports of breast tissue tenderness after cannabis use in females. So that was sort of the origin of that discussion around, does cannabis impact aromatization of testosterone into estrogen? And you can find a little bit of evidence for that, but you can also find evidence to the contrary in the scientific literature. So I'm just curious your thoughts.
It's super mixed. So I mean, you talk about something like prolactin, for example. That is another one that's obviously involved in this whole cascade stuff. Generally, I would say the bulk of the literature actually says that cannabis would suppress prolactin, not increase it. That's the majority of the literature that's out there.
Because dopamine is one of the main ways that prolactin is suppressed. They're kind of in a seesaw. They work in somewhat seesaw fashion.
And it probably, I mean, the rodent work would suggest it's through dopamine that's turning off prolactin, because you can reverse some of these effects by playing with dopamine signaling. So I don't doubt that's the mechanism. But so typically I would say more often, I mean, there's studies with inhalation and IV that have generally found reduced prolactin, and in chronic cannabis users, they find somewhat lower resting states of prolactin. That's been found in one study that came out of Yale.
Interesting.
Testosterone gets a little bit more complicated because there are a lot of studies that find, to begin with, cannabis users may have higher levels of testosterone just at rest. Now, whether that's a pre-existing thing...
Is there any reason to think that would be the case?
I don't know. I mean, that being said, a lot of the stuff, now granted, this was mostly done in the 70s, and like, this is from my previous life, because my undergrad and graduate supervisor, he was a neuroendocrinologist, focused much more on sex hormones and reproductive hormones. So we've written a few reviews. So I've done like reviews on this area, and I know the literature somewhat. It's mixed, but generally from the 70s studies, what they would often see is that if they would serially look at testosterone after someone consumed, they would have little dips. Like that wasn't uncommon for them to find it. Not every study found it. That being said, the kind of range that testosterone stayed in was always the normative range. Like it was never that it went so low that someone would have classified as being hypogonadal or would lead to something like gynecomastia, at least from a testosterone deficiency side, in terms of the balance between testosterone and estradiol. I don't know as much about the aromatization side of it. Again, I'd say it's pretty mixed. I mean, I don't think the gynecomastia stuff is, I mean, certainly people online might be talking about it, and there might be some other components to this. I've also heard, and again, this isn't like science, this is just the same kind of stuff you see on random internet communities, people talking about, oh, well, you know, it has plant estrogens, so maybe they're subbing in and having estrogenic effects. I don't know how valid any of this is.
Yeah, it seems a bit, I mean, there are phytoestrogens in tons of different plants. So the sort of attacks on soy and the attacks on, this I think grew out of the kind of the soy versus meat communities and plant-based versus carnivore. This podcast has always been agnostic with respect to nutrition, and is really, if we encourage anything, it's that people consume unprocessed and minimally processed foods as the bulk of their food intake. There seems to be enough data on that. But whether or not people choose to be vegan and eat a lot of plants, or carnivore and eat just meat, you know, we've essentially stepped out of that debate because let's just say it's as futile as about any other debate. You're just never going to, it's completely circular. You end up right back in Twitter.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, when it comes to something like this, I don't I've not seen any compelling evidence for it. So I certainly wouldn't say that it's a typical side effect that men would experience is like developing breast tissue in response to cannabis. I feel like if that was the case, it would be very known in the scientific community as something that comes out.
So this seems to be something that purportedly occurs on a backdrop of elevated androgens, meaning in puberty or a backdrop of some other form of androgen increase.
Like someone who's on steroids.
Yeah, but that's not the community I'm referring to.
Yeah.
It seems that because transient gynecomastia during puberty is actually fairly common because of there's just so much androgen being produced in puberty that some gets aromatized, and that the idea, I'm not stating this as fact, is that it may exacerbate that. In any case, it sounds like the takeaway from this is that there aren't a lot of conclusive studies about the effects of cannabis on testosterone or estrogen or aromatization in any direction.
I mean, I'd say like, there's enough studies to suggest that you might see transient drops in testosterone from cannabis, and it seems to be relatively short-lived. It doesn't seem to, but again, a lot of these studies also find that the basal testosterone is already kind of high to begin with. So you're staying in a normal dynamic range.
It is, again, it's homeostatic, just like the endocannabinoids.
Yeah. So, and that's the thing. I mean, testosterone fluctuates across the day anyway. So there's other things that fluctuate. It's like cortisol. These hormones have cycles. So as long as you're in this normal range, there really shouldn't be any kind of like behavioral, like in terms of sex drive for testosterone, or like physiological, like gynecomastia or some change in, I mean, now there are potentially effects of THC directly on the testes that could affect sperm. That could happen independent of changes in testosterone.
Are those positive or negative changes? I'm assuming that the studies you're referring to saw disrupted what they call sperm quality, which has to do with motility, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the kind of in vitro stuff definitely would suggest that. Some of the animal stuff as well. The human stuff is definitely a bit mixed. I mean, but again, if anything, it would be like, could have some effect on sperm. So I have like...
As we say this, I'm just chuckling to myself because anytime this conversation comes up about a substance and sperm quality or egg quality, I always get a barrage of comments of people telling me how many children they conceived while under the influence. No one is saying that you're going to be infertile. But, if people are having challenges conceiving, it might be something to think about.
I would say that. I would agree on that. So I would say if someone was asking me this and they were trying to get pregnant and struggling, I would say, well, definitely cut cannabis because some people may be more impacted by it than others. So for some, various biological reasons that we don't have a biomarker for, there may be some men that use cannabis. and it has a profound effect on their sperm quality, their sperm capacitance, their ability to maintain fertility. And for the bulk majority of men, I'd say that's probably not the case. But again, if you're someone who is struggling and you use cannabis, male or female, I would say cut that out and see if that has an effect for you.
Along those lines, I saw it kind of a jaw-dropping statistic, and I'm not sure I still believe it. But you tell me what you know about this, which is that up to 15% of pregnant women in the U.S. have used cannabis during pregnancy. That just seems that number just seems too high, and yet it exists out there.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, I've heard higher numbers
in the
than
research
that.
literature.
No, I've heard higher numbers.
Okay,
than that
so
as
I'm
well.
on the low end of this.
No, well, I mean, so I've heard as low as 2, and I've heard as high as 20.
Okay, 2 sounds like okay. That I could imagine. But as high as 20. And do we know what the effects on the developing fetus are?
There's a lot to unpack there. So first thing, going back to the levels, that's challenging because, again, this depends on, are you talking about self-report or are you talking about verified blood levels? Because those have varied. So some of the higher numbers actually come from blood levels where they've taken blood samples and found THC, but the women have reported not using cannabis. And so the idea that it's like the self-report numbers tend to come in around 2 or 3. My guess is the real number is probably somewhere around 10%, but that also is going to vary depending on what you're talking about because there are a proportion of people who are using cannabis and become pregnant and are unaware they're pregnant and are still using cannabis, and that would still qualify under the way that it's defined that someone used cannabis while pregnant. So the majority, I would say the overwhelming majority of people, once they learn they're pregnant, now that can be all the way up to almost the end of the first trimester, typically stop using cannabis. That seems to be the norm, I would say.
Important point there.
Yeah, and I think also the number that carry on through the entire gestational period is going to be a lot less, I would guess. Now, the motivations for this quite often are more in the capacity of the kind of anti-nauseant qualities that cannabis can have for some people and for women struggling with morning sickness. Now, anecdotally, I have heard women say, with the history of things like thalidomide and other anti-nauseant drugs that had profound teratogenic effects on the fetuses, women have said that they would rather use cannabis than one of these other compounds because they're less concerned about the impacts of cannabis than they are because of the thalidomide effects that happened. And
thalidomide effects are malformation of the limbs and other bodily structures in fetuses. It was an absolute tragedy of medicine that this occurred in even one birth. But it's the reason why thalidomide is now, I believe, banned as a drug for use during pregnancy.
Yeah, I actually have no idea, but I would imagine. I think it would be one of those hard things to sell, given its history, especially. But so I think there's a reticence of a lot of people to consider using pharmaceuticals to regulate nausea because they're uncertain of the consequences of it. And they feel that cannabis may be safer. Now, that in and of itself could present some problems in terms of that thought process. Now, there was also a study that I thought was like, some of these things just frustrate you. It's where they actually decided to call, this was done in Colorado, where they called dispensaries and just acted naive and asked what their recommendations were. And it was something like 80 to 85% of them were actually recommending that people would use cannabis to manage morning sickness. And I thought that was like, it's just one of these disappointing things where you're like, why are you being so wildly irresponsible to kind of promote these things? And this is...
You're talking about the irresponsible that the dispensaries would say that?
Yeah.
Or irresponsible that the study was carried out that way? Because it's a little bit of...
entrapment.
You said it, not me.
Could be. I mean, you can balk at either side of this. I think it's... I have a lot of frustration in general with the information that bud tenders put out into the world.
Is that what they're called? Bud tenders?
Bud tenders. That's kind of the colloquial term that people will use for someone who sells cannabis at a dispensary. We see this in Canada, and I've heard this throughout the States as well. I personally have been a huge advocate for the fact that I think, I worked in restaurants and bars and stuff when I was younger. And for me to serve alcohol, I had to undergo, I don't know if you do this in the States. In Canada, you have to do like a it's like a weekend course essentially called like Serving It Right or some other terminology where you learn the basics of alcohol, harms, blah, 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 how to tell if someone's intoxicated, when you have to cut them off, all these things that you have to do to be able to serve alcohol. I have no idea if this exists in the States, but it was a thing in Canada.
Bartenders in the U.S., put in the comments on YouTube, do you have to undergo training about alcohol to be a bartender?
Anything, even if it's just like an online quiz. But like, so my perspective is because pre-legalization, at least in Canada, there was somewhat of, I think, of a misguided thought that people would leverage their physicians for knowledge about cannabis. And what's become very apparent is that the overwhelming majority of people talk to the people selling them the cannabis. And yet those people selling cannabis don't need to have undergone any form of education. And so like this kind of kills me because we've worked very hard to try and create educational platforms that are like agnostic in terms of our position on cannabis, that are just based on the science. I'm an executive director of an organization called the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids, the CCIC, and we've done CME courses for physicians to try and train them about cannabis because I think it's important that physicians understand this. But I've tried suggesting that I think that anyone selling cannabis should undergo a course like this, just so that there's some consensus in the informed level that someone who comes in, because a lot of people going to buy cannabis are quite naive about it. And they just, I mean, even when we're talking about dosing, what we've talked about with edibles or smoking or how people consume it, like you need to have a reliable source of information at the front